Hey guys, tonight we're going to time travel somewhere deeply uncomfortable. Picture it. The year is 1327. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something far less poetic. Something that burns the nostrils and curls the toes. You're standing in a narrow alley of a medieval town. It's barely dawn. The cobblestones are slick, but not from rain. And there's an undeniable aroma wafting from, well, every direction. You, my friend, have just arrived in a world where toilet paper hasn't been invented yet, and I hate to break it to you, but you're going to need to go. Soon. And when that moment comes, there'll be no charming roll waiting patiently on a wall-mounted spindle. Just you, your dignity, and whatever nature or society happens to offer. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, where and when are you listening from tonight? Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You haven't been here long, but already the smell is aggressive. Your modern nose is deeply offended and your brain is screaming for lavender Febreze. But that simply doesn't exist. In fact, the entire idea of sanitation is still sort of a philosophical suggestion in the 1300s. The towns are bustling, noisy, charming in that ye old Instagram filter sort of way. But every step you take is accompanied by a slosh, squish, or, heaven forbid, a soft plop. You pass a couple of children playing with a stick in what you hope is mud. They're laughing. Their clothes are simple, rough-spun wool, a bit too big, clearly handed down. Their bare feet, let's just say they're not squeamish. You glance upward. Narrow buildings lean inward like gossiping grandmothers, windows creaking open on rusted hinges. A voice shouts, "Gardilou!" That's your only warning before a bucket of something splashes into the street. You freeze. The children don't even flinch. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where roofs were meant to keep rain out, and second-story windows were the preferred plumbing system. Your first instinct is to find a public restroom. Adorable. There's no such thing. The town's sanitation system is a charming blend of let gravity sort it out and hope it rains soon. The alleys are narrow rivers of refuse, especially in the early morning before anyone's tried to sweep, or at least redistribute the worst of it. And sweeping, by the way, is done with a bundle of twigs tied together. So, not terribly effective. People walk around like nothing is wrong, because to them, nothing is. This is normal. Acceptable, even. A bustling street means a healthy economy. And if the gutters reek, well, so does everyone else. Nobody's showering. Perfume is reserved for the wealthy. And if you were expecting a bar of soap, sorry. Most of what's available smells like ashes, goat fat, and despair. As you pass the local butcher, you try not to breathe through your nose. A pig's head stares at you from the wooden slab. Next to it, a barrel of organ sloshes in some reddish fluid you don't dare name. This is a good day. On bad days, there's no barrel at all, just offal rolling around with the rats. And trust me, the rats are winning. Your stomach turns, but not because of the meat, because you realize something very, very important. You need to go. And this is not a world with flush toilets, privacy stalls, or even decency laws about relieving yourself in a back alley. So you ask a friendly-looking passerby. An old woman, hunched from years of hard labor, points toward the edge of town. That way, love, but mind the nettles. You walk and walk and walk. Because in this era, if you want to do your business, you either use a chamber pot, and hope no one knocks it over before you empty it, or you head outside. Way outside. The town has what's called a midden heap. That's a charming euphemism for a big pile where people throw stuff they'd rather not smell anymore. Everything goes there: spoiled food, dead animals, and yes, human waste. You find it eventually. You'll know you're close when the flies start holding conventions around your face. You look around, trying to maintain some dignity. Not easy, since a pig is watching you with what feels like judgment. You find a semi-private bush, and then it hits you. What do you use to clean up? There's no answer. No roll of 2-ply. No packet of wet wipes. No helpful sanitary disposal bin. Just grass, leaves. Maybe a smooth stone if you're lucky and have good aim. Some people keep a rag tucked into their belt, but the truly grim part is that it's reused. Washed sometimes. Shared even. You spot a mossy-looking rock. That'll have to do. Just as you're finishing up, a breeze picks up, and you realize you're not alone. A goat stares. Its eyes are voids of existential menace. And the worst part? This wasn't even considered a problem back then. If anything, you'd be laughed at for caring. Hygiene was associated with vanity. Cleanliness wasn't godliness, it was suspicious. Why would someone need to wash so often unless they were trying to hide something? You might even be accused of witchcraft, or worse, French. So you return to the town center, trying not to limp. A market is being set up. A barrel of fish is opened. The smell is catastrophic. You blend in. You must blend in, because standing out might mean someone asks where you're from, and the future is not going to earn you any favors. As the sun climbs higher, the streets dry a little. The muck stiffens into crusty footprints. You dodge a wheelbarrow overflowing with cabbages. A man sneezes on you cheerfully. You try to wipe it off with the sleeve of your borrowed cloak, but you're not sure that helps. And then you remember, this is only day one. No soap, no toothpaste, and absolutely no toilet paper. You're going to need a very strong stomach, and maybe a goat of your own for moral support. Ready to continue. You're not even halfway through the day, and already you've gained an unfortunate level of experience in medieval street sanitation. But just when you think you've seen and smelled it all, night begins to fall, and that's when things really get intimate. Because now, dear traveler, it's time to face a much more personal reality. You need to sleep somewhere, and wherever you sleep eventually, you'll need to go again. Public latrines. Don't be silly. You're not in a bustling Roman city anymore. This is the 1300s, and infrastructure is something people build after the plague, not before it. You find a corner in a modest home. Someone's been kind enough to let you stay the night. It's cramped, shared with at least 7 other people, including one man who snores like he's channeling thunder from beneath the floorboards. The room smells of smoke, onions, and something vaguely sour. There's straw on the floor, but no bed for you. You're a guest, after all. You get the corner. And then you see it. A pot. A simple, wide-mouthed ceramic container sitting quietly near the wall, looking suspiciously innocent. It is not a vase. It is not for soup. Welcome to the chamber pot. It's exactly what it sounds like. A pot for your chamber, used by everyone in the household, including you. There's no real privacy. No, excuse me, I need to use the restroom. Just a quick look around to make sure no one's watching, or everyone is pretending not to. A hiked-up tunic and the mental fortitude of a stoic philosopher. You crouch. You pray the pot is stable. It wobbles slightly. Nothing terrifying. Just enough to raise your blood pressure. The room creaks with every movement. A small child stirs in their sleep and mutters something about geese. You try not to make a sound. Now here's the fun part. The pot doesn't get emptied after every use. It gets emptied once. Usually in the morning. Sometimes, if someone remembers. And guess whose job that is? Not yours, fortunately. You're the guest. But the household's youngest or lowest ranking member will be chosen as the unfortunate emptier. They'll tiptoe through the early morning gloom, carrying the precious pot through town to the dung heap or gutter, trying desperately not to spill a drop. And yes, they're likely barefoot. There's a reason shoes were optional, but ankle-deep calluses were not. Of course, this entire ritual depends on you having a chamber pot. Not everyone does. In poor homes, people might just go outside, behind the barn, into the field, or in the river if they're particularly bold and unconcerned about downstream consequences. But chamber pots were seen as a sign of domestic civility. Owning one meant you had some sense of decorum. Some households even had beautifully decorated ones, painted pots with floral designs, saints' names, or humorous faces inside the bowl. Nothing makes relieving yourself more cheerful than a smiling face staring back up at you. Some people got very creative. There were folding stools with holes cut into the seat and space beneath for the pot. A kind of proto-toilet, if you will. But again, those were for the relatively wealthy. You've got a pot and a draft. And speaking of drafts, the stone walls of your temporary medieval Airbnb do not retain heat well. It's cold. You shift on your straw mat, wishing for a blanket that doesn't smell like boiled cabbage. You contemplate the chamber pot again, not because you need to go. Oh no, you're done for now. But because someone else is stirring. Old Marjorie. She's 70 if she's a day, with knees like door hinges and a determination forged in pestilence. She rises, squints in the dark, and makes her way to the pot. She does not make eye contact. Neither do you. The whole household has an unspoken agreement. Don't comment, don't acknowledge, and for heaven's sake, don't knock it over. Which has happened. Many times. Some chamber pots have lids, but most don't. They sit uncovered, waiting for someone with enough coordination to carry them out the next day. Some towns even employed early morning gong farmers or night soil men, glamorous titles for the brave souls who went house to house, collecting chamber pots and dumping them en masse. Imagine the resume. Skills, punctual, odor-resistant, extremely careful with sloshing buckets. But this isn't one of those towns. Here, it's all DIY. You make the mess, you carry the mess. Unless you're important, of course. Then someone else does it for you. Which brings us to the great pot dilemma. Where do you actually dump it? Legally, you're supposed to walk it to the edge of town and pour it into the designated waste pit. Realistically, you open a window. You shout, "Gardez-le," from the French, "Regardez-le." Watch out for the water. And then you toss. Some people don't even shout. They just assume everyone else has good reflexes. You think back to earlier today, when something suspicious landed near your foot in the alley. You didn't know what it was. You were happier then. As the night stretches on, you notice something strange. People don't seem that bothered. They've adapted. This is life. You, on the other hand, are still trying to remember where your hand sanitizer is, even though it won't exist for another 600 years. But don't worry. You'll get used to it. Everyone does. Eventually, the smell dulls. The pot becomes routine. You learn to balance shame and necessity like a true medieval survivor. And as you finally drift off to sleep, Curled beside the drafty wall with straw poking your ribs, a new thought creeps in. Tomorrow, you'll have to empty that pot yourself, unless someone else wakes up first, and you're not above pretending to sleep just a little longer. Because in the 1300s, dignity doesn't come from what you wipe with. It comes from knowing when to not make eye contact and when to run. Morning in a medieval town begins with sound, clattering hooves over cobblestones, roosters that may or may not be confused about time zones, and a cacophony of merchants shouting prices for items that smell suspiciously like yesterday's items. You stretch, reluctantly peeling yourself off the straw mattress. The air is cold and your cloak is no less itchy than it was the night before. But worst of all is the reminder. The pot. It's full. And unfortunately for you, everyone else woke up later than you did. You lock eyes with it like it's an opponent in a duel. There is no escape. A woman gives you an approving nod as she opens the door. You are now the official emptier. So here you are, chamber pot in hand, warm, sloshing, and profoundly humbling. You shuffle out of the house, trying not to spill a drop. But the moment you step outside, you realize that your pot's contents will soon blend in perfectly. Because the streets, they are already alive. Not with people, although there are plenty of those, but with substances. Mud? Possibly. Manure? Definitely. Bits of fish? Confirmed. The line between trash and ground is more suggestion than boundary. You walk gingerly, dodging puddles of uncertain origin. A dog trots past you, chewing on something that was almost definitely once part of something else. Behind you, someone dumps their own chamber pot out a window. No warning shout this time. It lands not far from where you stood just seconds earlier. You feel lucky. That's not a good sign. You find a small stream running through the edge of town. It's supposed to carry waste away, but the water is shallow and sluggish. More of a suggestion of motion than a reliable flush. You empty your burden with a mix of relief and mild self-disgust. Then you head back through the maze of urban decay. Welcome to the streets of filth. See, in the 1300s, urban planning wasn't much of a priority. Streets were narrow, winding, and, because most towns grew organically, completely unpaved. In dry seasons, they were dust bowls. In wet ones, they were ankle-deep swamps of humanity's worst choices. Most towns had a central ditch running down the middle of the main road. That was the drainage system. Everyone threw their waste into it. Kitchen scraps, animal entrails, fish bones, excrement. And by everyone, we mean you now too. At certain times of day, a town crier might walk through shouting hygiene laws. No dumping before dawn. No guts on market days. These were often ignored. The enforcers were underpaid, overwhelmed, and, frankly, just as smelly as everyone else. And let's talk about footwear. You're lucky. You arrived in sturdy, modern shoes. But most people here wear leather slippers or simple wooden clogs, if they wear shoes at all. Kids? Completely barefoot, and they sprint through these streets like it's recess, which, in a way, it is. If you consider dodging horse dung a kind of athletic training. The marketplace is particularly challenging. You see raw meat displayed on wooden planks covered in flies. Live chickens squawk from baskets. Someone sells fish that are no longer flipping. The stone underfoot is slimy. You try not to slip. And then you notice something truly special. A man relieving himself against a wall. Just casually. Mid-conversation. No shame. No one bats an eye. Privacy? Not a medieval value. But lest you think it's all chaos, take comfort. Some cities tried. In London, for instance, laws existed against dumping waste in the streets. Fines were issued. Shaming occurred, but enforcement was patchy. In Paris, royal edicts banned emptying chamber pots out windows without warning. A low bar, but a bar nonetheless. Cities occasionally hired rakers, people who scraped the muck into carts and hauled it outside the city walls. These rakers were often hated, not because of their smell, but because they charged fees. No one wanted to pay to get rid of something they could just toss out the window. Then there were the gutter snipes, children who scour the streets looking for lost coins, edible scraps, or small treasures amidst the filth. You spot one now, darting through a herd of goats, grinning as he pockets something shiny that you definitely hope isn't what it looks like. This is where disease brews. Fleas, rats, rotting meat, standing water. No one knows about bacteria yet, but people have theories. Bad air, unbalanced humors, or being cursed by your neighbor's jealous thoughts. You see a man burning herbs in a little metal dish and waving them around like he's warding off demons. In a way, he is. You step into a cleaner alley, less sludge, more hay. For a moment, you think you found peace. But then a gust of wind kicks up a smell so awful, so unnatural, it actually causes your eyes to water. You turn a corner and find the culprit, the tanner's workshop. Leather was made by soaking animal hides in urine and then scraping off the hair with lye and quicklime. And yes, the urine was collected, often from public donations. Pee for the poor was a thing. You pass barrels of yellowish liquid, trying not to imagine how warm it is. The workers barely notice you. They're used to gawkers and used to the smell. You, however, are not. Even in towns with paved sections, the problem remained. Stones got slippery with use. People fell. In fact, broken limbs from street slime were so common that some towns offered street hazard compensation. That's right, medieval insurance. You slip, you sue. Well, sort of. More like complain loudly and hope for a loaf of bread. At this point, you wonder how anyone ever got used to this. And the truth is, they didn't. Not really. They just didn't know anything else. The word filth didn't carry the same meaning. It was part of life. Just another texture of daily existence. And yet, somehow, amidst all of this, people lived. They married, had children, wrote poetry, sang songs, built cathedrals, all while walking through literal rivers of waste. You step back into the main street, breathing through your mouth like a true local. A donkey passes by and stops directly in front of you to relieve itself. You close your eyes. You've made it through another lesson in survival. And tomorrow, you'll learn what people actually used to wipe. Spoiler, it's not great. You made it through the night. You braved the pot. You survived the streets. And now, friend, it's time we talk about something no one wants to think about, but absolutely everyone in the 1300s had to. What did people actually wipe with? You stand in the morning light, watching as the town stirs to life again. Chickens cluck, children chase each other barefoot through alleys that you now know too well, and someone somewhere is shouting about radishes. You're starting to feel like you've got a handle on things. Until you need to go again. This time, you're further from shelter. No pot, no house. Just the great outdoors and your increasingly delicate sensibilities. You look around. No toilet paper. No leaves that look particularly friendly. You take a deep breath and prepare yourself for what the Middle Ages had to offer. Let's go through the options. Option 1. The communal rag. You've heard rumors about this one already. A cloth, sometimes called a clout, that's shared among household members, rinsed occasionally and reused. Some were small squares tied to belts for easy access. Others hung in outhouses or near middens ready for communal use. You're not sure what's worse, the thought of using it or the thought of having to wring it out after. Option 2, nature's bounty. Leaves, grass, straw, moss, and, in colder climates, snow. Yes, snow. Bracing, but at least sterile. Moss is a crowd favorite among peasants living near forests. It's soft, absorbent, and practically luxurious by medieval standards. Just mind the insects. Nothing quite ruins a moment like discovering something still living on your chosen wipe. Option 3, shells and stones. Yes, you heard that right. Smooth river stones were prized for their reuse potential. Rinse and repeat, literally. But in coastal areas, seashells were common, flat, fan-shaped shells. A little too sharp for comfort, you might think. And you'd be right. A surprising number of historical injuries went unrecorded, but historians suspect shell-related mishaps were not uncommon. Option 4, your left hand. Used in many parts of the medieval world, especially when water was available for rinsing. The left hand became the designated wiping hand, and that's why shaking hands with the left was considered deeply offensive. If someone reached out their left hand to greet you, they either had a cruel sense of humor, or they were about to cast a hex. Possibly both. Option 5, nothing at all. Yes, some people didn't wipe. They let time do the work. Just pull up your tunic and walk it off. Gravity, airflow, and a complete disregard for personal comfort did the rest. It's not efficient, it's not pleasant, but it was, sadly, not unusual. You now understand why scented herbs were carried in pouches or tucked into sleeves. It wasn't to impress, it was to survive. Now, there were some regional innovations. In ancient Rome, for instance, people used a tessorium, a sponge attached to a stick, stored in a bucket of vinegar. But the Roman Empire is long gone by your time, and the sponge on a stick has gone out of fashion. Too soft, too Roman, too expensive. In the 1300s, there's no standard, no official method. What people use depends on where they live, how much money they have, and how badly they want to avoid a rash. Peasants use hay, nobles use cloth, sometimes even silk, which frankly seems excessive. But silk doesn't solve the fundamental problem, it just makes it feel more ironic. You meet a merchant named Jakub who swears by linen strips. Only the finest scraps, he says proudly, like he's describing imported wine. He folds them carefully and burns them after use, because unlike most folks, he can afford to. He offers to show you his wiping pouch. You politely decline. Then there's Agnes, a washerwoman who tells you she's seen it all. A goose feather once, she says, shaking her head. Fancy folk will try anything. You want to ask about how that even works, but her 1,000-yard stare tells you not to. Some monasteries had their own rules. Certain orders of monks were allowed only a specific number of wipes per bowel movement. 3. That's it. Recorded in ledgers, checked by senior monks. No, I'm not making this up. Imagine being spiritually judged by your efficiency. As for children, well, they learned by imitation, and a lot of trial and error. Cloth diapers weren't common for peasants, and changing a baby was more about scraping than swapping. You pass a young mother patting her child's backside with a handful of hay and humming a lullaby. The baby looks suspiciously smug. But here's the thing, no one talks about it. It's not a polite subject. Everyone does it. No one discusses it. Sound familiar? In fact, some medieval manuscripts do mention hygiene, but always obliquely. There are references to cleansing one's fundament or refreshing the nether parts. Very poetic, very vague. very unhelpful. And then there's the truth that historians still debate. Did medieval people care about cleanliness at all? Some evidence suggests they did. Bathhouses existed, at least before the church got suspicious of them. People used herbs and water to wash. They cleaned their homes with brooms and ashes. But wiping, it just wasn't a priority. Which brings us to this unfortunate sentence. Some scholars argue that the act of wiping only became regularized much later. Let that sink in. You may be among the first humans to truly commit to the daily wipe as a cultural norm. Congratulations. As you move on through the village, you see a man drying what looks like cloth squares on a line. You realize with dawning horror that those aren't napkins. You quietly take a different path, and still, despite everything, people here seem content. They laugh, they flirt, they sell bread. Life continues. You, however, are now acutely aware of every surface you touch. You consider wearing gloves forever, but you persevere, because you have to, and because this is the 1300s, and the real question isn't just how people wiped. It's how they wiped and still managed to build cathedrals, compose madrigals, and survive long enough to invent, eventually, the blessed miracle of toilet paper. And if that's not human resilience, I don't know what is. You have survived the streets, the pot, and the wiping. You're not quite clean, but you are, somehow, still here. And as the sun reaches its peak and bells ring out across the rooftops, it occurs to you, maybe now is a good time to wash your hands. Good luck with that. Because here in the 1300s, washing, at least in the sense you know it, is not exactly popular, or trusted, or in some cases, even permitted. And this brings us to today's lesson in confusion and contradiction, holy water and hygiene. Let's get one thing straight right away. People in the Middle Ages weren't trying to be dirty. They simply had a different understanding of what clean meant. In many cases, physical cleanliness was seen as less important than spiritual cleanliness. And believe it or not, the two were sometimes considered opposites. That's right. If you washed too often, people got suspicious. What did you have to hide? A guilty conscience? A secret affair? A pact with the devil sealed with lemon-scented soap? You wander into a church. It's cool and dark inside. Candles flicker. Incense floats in the air. Sweet, thick, and mercifully strong enough to mask the street stench still clinging to your cloak. There's a stone basin at the entrance. Holy water. You dip your fingers in automatically. Congratulations. That's probably the cleanest liquid you'll touch all day. Holy water is one of the few substances considered both purifying and socially acceptable to touch frequently. Not just for rituals. People use it to bless themselves, to anoint babies, and occasionally to splash at family members who haven't bathed since Easter. Outside, you pass a public fountain, an elaborate one, fed by an aqueduct built centuries ago by Romans who definitely would have judged everyone alive right now. A man fills a wooden bucket. You ask him if the water is clean. He shrugs. Cleaner than wine, he says. Not comforting. But then again, wine is safer, so is ale. Boiling the liquid during brewing kills off most of the nasty bits. That's why many people, including children, drink weak ale with every meal. Because don't drink the water isn't just a travel tip. It's a survival strategy. As for actual bathing, let's just say it's controversial. In the early medieval period, public bathhouses were common in many European cities. People bathed communally, naked, and often with added herbs or scented oils. It was social, relaxing, hygienic even. But as time passed, the church began to raise concerns. Bathing, you see, involved nudity, and nudity led to temptation, and temptation led to sin. You can see where this is going. By the 1300s, many bathhouses had been closed or repurposed. The ones that remained were often suspected of doubling as brothels. And while a few brave souls continued to advocate for washing with soap and water, others began to associate too much cleanliness with vanity and even disease. Yes, disease. The belief was that washing opened the pores, allowing bad miasmas, or poisonous airs, to enter the body. Dirt, paradoxically, was seen as a kind of armor, a protective coating like medieval sunscreen, just darker and smellier. So instead of scrubbing themselves down, people focused on spot cleaning, a quick rinse of the hands before meals, maybe, a dab of rose water on the wrists, a change of underclothes if you were lucky enough to own more than one set. And for the truly elite, a personal servant who might boil water and help you bathe behind a curtain. If there was time, and if the moon was in the right phase, you'd try to clean your hands in a basin near the baker's stall. The water is cloudy, a little slimy, but it's something. You notice others doing the same. Some splash, others sniff the water and walk away. One man simply wipes his hands on his dog. You pass a monk who smells of lavender and looks deeply uncomfortable about it. He carries a pouch of dried herbs around his neck to guard the humors. Another man rubs garlic on his chest, not for cooking, for health. Garlic keeps bad spirits away, and friends, probably. And yet, you find moments of cleverness. In some towns, barbers function as part-time surgeons and even dentists. They carry leeches, they clean wounds, they recommend rose soap, though whether it's for healing or just to mask the blood is unclear. You come across a wealthy merchant's daughter dipping her hands in a basin of milk and honey. Her skin glows. She offers you a drop. You accept. It smells like luxury and misplaced priorities. But before you can feel too envious, a servant rushes in to collect the bowl, then pours it directly into the garden. Waste not, want not. There's something charming in how people try. Even without the knowledge of germs or the joy of indoor plumbing, medieval folks wanted to be clean. They just had no idea how to do it properly without accidentally killing themselves in the process. You ask a local why people don't bathe more often. He raises an eyebrow. Bathing's for the dead, he says. They wash you before burial. Best not tempt fate. You thank him and walk away slowly. By the end of the day, you're grimy. There's dirt under your fingernails. Your tunic has absorbed smells it may never release. You dream of soap, of clean sheets, of hot water that doesn't have a layer of oil floating on top. But you also start to notice something else. Your tolerance is building. The smell doesn't hit quite as hard. The itch is manageable. And as for the judgment from others, it's vanished. Because here, in the 1300s, cleanliness is not next to godliness. It's somewhere behind superstition and a healthy fear of bath water. Ready to dive deeper? You've begun to understand that in the 1300s, cleanliness is less about soap and more about survival. And yet, as your journey continues, you stumble across a curious contradiction. A world that's both deeply unwashed and obsessed with rules. And nowhere is this contradiction clearer than in the monasteries. Welcome to the world of monks, leaves, and rules. It's a quiet morning. You're walking through the countryside, the air sharp with the scent of damp grass and distant wood smoke. Birds chirp, a donkey brays in the distance, and then you hear it. soft chanting rhythmically echoing through the valley. You follow the sound to a low stone building nestled among trees, surrounded by low walls and a vegetable garden, a monastery. The monks here live according to the rule of Saint Benedict, a code so precise it practically micromanages the divine. When to pray, when to eat, when to sleep, and yes, when to go. You're greeted by a novice monk named Brother Thomas. He's 20 years old, shaves only the center of his scalp, and smells like turnips and wet wool. He's very kind, though he does not shake your hand. You suspect this has more to do with a left-hand issue than monastic humility. He offers to show you around. You try to keep up as he explains the daily rhythms of monastic life. Hours of prayer, work in the garden, and communal meals eaten in total silence. The monks speak only through hand signals or the occasional raised eyebrow. You, meanwhile, have approximately 1,000 questions, none of which can be answered with eyebrow gestures. And then, finally, you spot something intriguing. A latrine block. It's a long, narrow building with wooden seats inside, each cut with a hole and separated by low dividers that offer very little privacy. Beneath the seats, a channel of water runs gently, fed by a diverted stream. It's one of the few examples of medieval sanitation that actually seems clever. Gravity, nature, and quiet desperation working together in perfect harmony. Thomas explains quietly that the latrine is used at specific times. No loitering, no chatting, certainly no reading. Though the idea of someone reading in that echoing chamber of methane and judgment is hilarious. Here's where it gets fun. Monks were sometimes limited in how much they were allowed to wipe. As mentioned earlier, some monastic rules permitted exactly 3 pieces of wiping material per visit. Not 4, not 2, 3. Austerity, after all, builds character. The material, usually leaves, dried, stacked, sometimes collected by younger monks on leaf-gathering duty. You pass a shed where the leaves are stored, brown, brittle, and not particularly promising. Other orders used scraps of cloth or bundled straw, and of course, the communal sponge on a stick made its occasional appearance. Monks were known to wash their hands after latrine use, sometimes with cold water, out of a stone basin, without soap, so partial credit. Interestingly, monks were some of the few medieval folk who did bathe regularly, but not for comfort, for ritual. Cleanliness in the monastery wasn't about smelling good, it was about self-discipline and humility. And doing exactly what the abbot said, even if that included scrubbing your feet with cold water once a month. You ask Thomas if they ever use holy water in the latrine. He looks at you like you've just proposed heresy. You apologize and move on. The monks are meticulous in other ways too. The herb garden is neatly ordered, with lavender and rosemary planted near the latrines, ostensibly to clean the air. You note that no amount of lavender is winning this battle. Still, the effort is appreciated. And then there are the rules. Oh, the rules. Every aspect of monastic toiletry life is regulated. When to go, where to go, what to say, hint, nothing. What to wear while going, never your full habit. What to do if someone catches fire mid-wipe. Okay, that one's not in the rule book, but honestly, you wouldn't be surprised. Even in the quietest places on Earth, people still had to face the same biological truth. No one gets out of it. And then there's the copying. You're led to the scriptorium, a dimly lit room where monks bend over parchment, carefully transcribing texts by candlelight. Among the prayer books and psalters, you notice something else. A manuscript page covered in scribbles, marginal doodles, and a drawing of someone relieving themselves. Thomas blushes. "Brother Anselm," he says. "He had a phase." Apparently, even monks have bad days. As the sun begins to set, you realize something. This is the cleanest you've felt in days. The monastery is far from sterile, but it tries. The rules, the rituals, the gentle stream under the latrines, it all speaks to a desire for order, for some kind of peace, even in the most unpeaceful corners of human existence. You thank Thomas. He blesses you. You pretend not to trip over your own cloak as you leave, and as you walk back into the noisier, messier world beyond the monastery walls, you carry with you a quiet truth. Even in a world without toilet paper, someone took the time to think, let's make this slightly less awful. You've waded through peasant life, sniffed the monastic attempt at order, and now, as the church bells toll somewhere behind you, it's time to lift the veil on the folks everyone thinks had it easier. Welcome to the fragrant, perfumed, velvet-draped world of the nobility, where the floors may be polished, but the plumbing still doesn't exist. This is Section 7, Royal Flush, the noble struggle. You approach a manor house, its stone facade laced with ivy, banners fluttering proudly in the breeze. A few pigs scurry out of your path. A servant opens the heavy oak door and barely glances at your road-worn cloak, which now smells like chamber pot, turnip, and humility. Inside, the air changes. There's incense burning in a wall niche. Tapestries hang everywhere, covering draughts and damp stone with scenes of saints, unicorns, and at least one poorly drawn lion that looks suspiciously like a cat having a bad day. The floors are strewn with rushes, sweet-smelling herbs and straw to mask the stench that builds up over the months. Yes, months. These rushes aren't changed weekly, as you may have imagined. They're more of a seasonal feature. You're led through the hall to a small chamber, technically private, but barely so. And there it is, a close stool. Picture a wooden chair, but with a hole cut in the seat and a chamber pot tucked underneath. Some versions are padded. Some even have lids. The more opulent ones are carved, gilded and blessed by someone who clearly hadn't sat on one in winter. You run your hand along the edge. It's worn smooth. You wonder how many royal posteriors have graced this throne. Then a servant brings in the groom of the stool. Yes, that was a real job. This man, always trusted, always discreet, is in charge of the royal bottom. His role includes preparing the stool, keeping linen cloths or sponges ready, and sometimes, if the royal bottom was particularly royal, actually assisting. You think back to your own struggles with moss and straw and suddenly feel very underdressed. You're told that noblemen and noblewomen of the period didn't wipe with leaves or rags. They used soft cloths, washed and reused. For the wealthiest, these cloths might be made of fine linen or even silk, because nothing says divine right to rule, like wiping with imported fabric. But luxury doesn't mean efficiency. Even with servants, noble life had its inconvenient truths. First, the castles were cold. Stone keeps are beautiful to look at, but they trap damp and echo every draught. Going to the privy in the dead of winter, an act of courage. Some nobles kept commodes in their chambers to avoid the frigid hallways. Others simply held it for as long as they could. Then there's the castle garderobe, the closest thing to a medieval toilet. Usually a wooden seat built into the outer wall of the castle, suspended over a chute or straight up freefall to the moat below. The idea was simple. Gravity would do the work. Until winter, when everything froze, or summer, when everything festered, you peek out of one such garderobe. The air is sharp and there's a suspicious buzzing sound coming from somewhere below. You decide not to investigate. Still, nobles had options peasants could only dream of. Access to scented herbs, servants to carry away chamber pots, and even privacy, a rare and cherished thing. Queen Elizabeth I, a couple of centuries later, but still, was rumored to have had her own portable toilet throne lined with velvet. Nobles at banquets might excuse themselves discreetly and return minutes later, having been followed by a very quiet servant holding a very serious bucket. And yes, the perfume. There were pouches of dried flowers, gloves soaked in rose oil, even hollowed-out pendants filled with crushed herbs called pommanders. Not to be fashionable, but to survive. The stench was always just one corridor away. But perhaps the most noble struggle of all was pretending none of this existed. Court etiquette dictated silence on bodily matters. You did not acknowledge smells. You did not mention the necessary. And you certainly didn't describe how many cloths you needed. Even royals, it seems, had a kind of toilet shame. You hear a lady-in-waiting whisper about a countess who once fainted in a garderobe because someone had forgotten to clear the chute. The scandal lasted weeks. The chute was never forgotten again. Despite the silks, the servants, the scented cloths, nobles weren't immune to infections, or rashes, or parasites. In fact, lice were considered such a natural part of life that some nobles kept ivory lice combs as heirlooms. Nothing says dynasty like inherited vermin tools. And here's the real twist. Some nobles envied the monastic lifestyle, the peace, the simplicity, the regular latrine cleaning schedule. You consider this while staring into a gold-gilded chamber pot and wonder if history has a strange sense of humor. Because while peasants had to wipe with moss and pray for rain, and monks used cold water and divine restraint, nobles wiped in silence and velvet, with the same end result. And just like everyone else, they still had to send someone out to dump the pot. Royalty, it seems, didn't get a flush. Just fancier buckets. You've handled moss, monks, and monarchs. You've learned what passes for cleanliness when the world believes bathing might invite demons into your pores. And now, just when you think things can't get more personal, it's time to talk about birth, babies, and things that scurry. Welcome to Section 8 of Mice and Midwives. You're invited, well, more like pulled, into a cottage at the edge of a village. Inside, the air is warm and thick with the smell of smoke, lavender, and something vaguely metallic. A woman is giving birth. Don't worry, you're not expected to help. You're just observing, quietly, respectfully, slightly horrified. Around her is a group of midwives, whispering prayers and sprinkling herbs. They move with practiced ease, stern but kind, authoritative but comforting. They've done this dozens of times, hundreds maybe. Midwives in the Middle Ages weren't merely helpers. They were respected and sometimes feared custodians of women's bodies. And in this moment, as the woman groans and sweats and prays to every saint she can remember, you realize something uncomfortable. This entire process is happening without plumbing. There's no sterilized water, no gloves, no gentle hum of hospital machines. There's a bucket, some cloths, a knife, and a large pile of hay spread beneath her to absorb the inevitable mess. The midwife, Agnes, explains, without blinking, that the hay will be burned later. And the cloth? Boiled. Probably, if there's fuel. If not, well, they'll be rinsed and reused. You nod and make a silent promise to never complain about anything again. As the baby finally arrives, screaming and red and absolutely covered in goo, another woman rushes forward with a rag dipped in wine. She wipes the child's face, then gently rubs the cord with ash and presses a spiderweb poultice to stop the bleeding. Yes, spiderwebs. Because medieval people believe they helped blood clot. And to be fair, they kind of do. It's both revolting and resourceful. The child is then wrapped in swaddling bands, layers upon layers of linen strips wound tightly around the baby to keep its limbs straight. The belief was that it helped the child grow properly and maybe even prevent moral weakness. You're not sure how that works, but there's a lot you're not sure of anymore. You're offered a chance to hold the baby. You politely decline. Your hands still smell like yesterday's fish market. Now, if you're wondering how all of this relates to toilet paper, trust me, you're about to see. Because newborns, of course, need wiping too. And that's where things get creative. Infants weren't put in diapers as you know them. Cloths were expensive. Washing them was labor-intensive. So many babies were simply swaddled and left for hours or more. The result? A lot of rashes, a lot of crying, and a lot of mothers scraping waste off linen with a stick. Some wealthier homes used moss-stuffed cloth pads, kind of like prehistoric diapers. Others applied clay or crushed chalk to prevent rashes, like a very ambitious attempt at baby powder. The babies, somehow, survived. But the real twist in this section? It's not the birth, it's what comes after. Because as night falls and the fire dims, the cottage begins to stir, not with people, but with movement along the walls. Mice, they're everywhere. Skittering, chewing, nesting in the straw. The midwives shoo them away absent-mindedly, used to their presence. They're part of the scenery. A nuisance, yes, but also a fact of life. You spot a small cradle hanging from the ceiling beams, suspended by rope. It's to keep the mice out, someone explains. You nod, because saying, "That's deeply upsetting," feels impolite. Mice chew on leather, cloth, wood, and, yes, swaddling bands. Some even crawl onto sleeping infants to get at food stains or crumbs. Superstitions abound. Mice stealing a baby's breath, biting off toes, bringing curses. So people get creative. They tuck dried mint in corners, set out bowls of ashes to catch prints, even tie cats to doorposts, not for decoration, but as a warning. Mice beware. You ask if they ever just clean the place. They laugh. Clean? With what time? With what tools? This is a world where waste is constant, and the effort to stay ahead of it is never-ending. Babies, mice, goats, and grown adults, all generating mess, and none of them offering to help tidy up. And yet, there's something oddly impressive about it. Despite everything, despite mice, midwives, and the absolute lack of shaman, life continues. The mother, now resting, eats warm bread. The baby hiccups quietly. Agnes wipes her hands on a cloth you hope will never touch a human face again. "Wasn't so bad," she mutters. "Better than last month. That one gave birth in the hayloft." You don't ask how that turned out. You step outside into the cold night. The stars are bright, and a mouse darts past your boot. You don't even flinch this time. Because in the 1300s, the struggle isn't just what to wipe with, it's what to live with. And sometimes that means mice. You've endured rags, velvet thrones, midwives, and mice. You've seen how wiping, washing, and surviving in the 1300s is less about sanitation and more about sheer willpower. But if you think people back then got away with doing whatever they wanted, wherever they wanted, you're in for a surprise. Welcome to Section 9, Public Shame and Privy Laws. You wake up to the sound of shouting. Not angry shouting, just official. A town crier marching down the main road, clanging a bell and bellowing announcements. Some are harmless enough. Market day moved to Thursday. But then he gets to this gem. Let it be known, no citizen shall defecate upon the church steps under penalty of fine, public whipping, or loss of sausage privileges. You blink. Did he just say church steps? Yes. Yes, he did. Because here's the thing, people had to go somewhere, and sometimes that somewhere ended up being anywhere. Alleys, ditches, behind walls, stairwells, barrels, doorsteps, even fountains. And after enough people got caught relieving themselves on inappropriate surfaces, laws began to appear. They were called privy laws, and they popped up all over Europe, each one slightly more exasperated than the last. Town councils grew tired of stepping in it, literally. So they created rules. Some were practical. London, 14th century. Residents must build privies that don't dump directly into neighbors' walls. Paris. Chamber pots must be emptied only in designated ditches, with a warning shout. Gare de Lyon was a popular one. Yes, that's a real word. Florence. Anyone caught using the public square as a toilet must pay a fine equal to a day's wages, or mop it up themselves with their shirt. Others were oddly specific. A man in York was once fined for defecating on a bridge during a funeral procession. In Prague, an edict banned relieving oneself in the presence of a goose. The record doesn't say why. We don't ask. And then there were the communal punishments. If no one fessed up to a particularly egregious incident, say someone using the mayor's garden wall as a personal urinal, the entire street could be fined. Collective guilt. Everyone got shamed until the culprit confessed or moved away. But even with these laws, enforcement was tricky. There weren't many toilet police. Instead, towns relied on shame. Public stocks, scarlet letters, or, most embarrassing of all, having your name recorded in the town ledger under disgusting habits. You'd never get a date again. You meet a man named Hob who tells you gleefully that he once saw a woman march through the village holding her own chamber pot upside down as punishment for flinging it at someone during an argument. You nod slowly, unsure who you're supposed to sympathize with. And then there's the truth beneath the rules. Most people knew what was acceptable. They just didn't always care. Privies, when available, were dark, cold, and infested. Many were just wooden boxes suspended over pits. No privacy, no ventilation, and definitely no bathroom attendant. So naturally, people often chose not to use them. You walk past one such structure now. It leans slightly to the left, smells like wet despair, and is guarded by a very aggressive chicken. You decide to wait, which brings us to a fascinating contradiction. In a world full of filth, there were still social boundaries. It was considered rude, deeply rude, to relieve yourself too close to a place of business, or near a water source, or on religious grounds. You don't need plumbing to understand the power of social shame. Some guilds even had hygiene codes. Bakers were forbidden from handling dough after chamber pot duty. Butchers couldn't clean knives near privy drains. And barbers, who doubled as surgeons, were told to keep all bodily expulsion discreet and distant from clients. You can't make this up. You see a young man trying to dump a chamber pot into a ditch that clearly says "no waste" in Latin. A passerby shouts at him. He shrugs. The pot tips. A tiny rebellion is born. But the real power of these laws wasn't in the punishment. It was in the performance. They told the world, we are civilized. We have standards. We may be standing ankle deep in horse manure, but by God, we will not urinate in front of the blacksmith's daughter again. And yet, the problems persisted, which led to something you didn't expect. Toilet-related architecture. Cities began to build public latrines. Rudimentary, sure, but better than nothing. Some were nothing more than open troughs behind screens. Others had seats, partitions, even signs. One in London charged a halfpenny and included straw for wiping. Luxury. The very wealthy sometimes donated latrines to their towns as acts of charity. You walk by one now, an ancient, crumbling brick hut with a plaque that reads, "To the Blessed Relief of All Souls, donated by Lady Cecily, 1372. A woman ahead of her time. And of course, not all punishments were physical. Sometimes the worst fate was becoming the butt of a ballad. Minstrels made songs about those who got caught. Verses were sung about men who missed the ditch, or ladies who slipped while squatting behind the alehouse. You hear one now, drifting from a nearby tavern. Oh, Richard the Tiler, he squatted too bold. He aimed at the ditch, but the wind it was cold. You stop listening. Some things should remain sacred. By the end of the day, you're struck by how hard people tried. Despite a lack of tools, knowledge, or even soap, they tried to keep some order. They tried to keep their streets and shoes clean. They tried sometimes to hold it just a little longer, because in the 1300s, staying clean wasn't just about comfort. It was about honor, reputation, and whether your name would live on as a generous latrine donor or the one who soiled the bishop's fountain. The air is thick today, too still, too quiet. Even the birds seem cautious, and the usual chaos of the village has dulled to a hush. You notice shutters drawn, doors locked, and people clutching herbs to their noses like it'll save them from breathing in the wrong breath. Something's different. This is not just another day of dirt and dung. This is the day you learn how wiping habits met a global catastrophe. Welcome to Section 10, The Plague and the Pot. You've heard murmurs already. Travelers from the south, rumors in the taverns. Boils the size of plums, they whisper. Skin black as pitch, dead by morning. And now, as you step through the eerily empty marketplace, the fear is no longer hearsay. It's real. It's everywhere. The Black Death has arrived, and with it comes not just horror, but an unexpected magnifying glass on hygiene, what little there was, and the desperate, often baffling things people did to keep themselves safe, including, yes, what they wiped with. Let's back up for a second. The Black Death swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population. That's not a typo. Entire towns were wiped out in a matter of weeks. And the culprit? A microscopic bacterium carried by fleas riding on rats. Creatures that, as you may recall, were already living rent-free in every corner of your life. You pass a group of flagellants marching through the street, chanting prayers and whipping themselves. They believe the plague is God's punishment for sin. And in fairness, if God is watching how people relieve themselves in this century, he may indeed be displeased. A woman opens her window and throws out the contents of a chamber pot, not bothering to yell, "Gardilou." You jump just in time. She glares at you like it's your fault for walking under her window in a crisis. During the plague, people become obsessed with smells. The miasma theory, the belief that foul air causes illness, dominates. So naturally, the focus shifts to covering odors, not eliminating them. Instead of improving sanitation, they burn incense, carry pomanders stuffed with cloves and ambergris, wipe themselves with herbed cloths, which supposedly freshen the air around the fundament. One man proudly tells you he wipes only with rosemary bundles. You nod, not because you're impressed, but because you're afraid to get closer. Midwives begin boiling their cloths more often, but not because they understand germs. They think heat drives out evil spirits. Public latrines are shuttered. Chamber pots overflow. People dig waste trenches outside the town walls and hope the stench will stay there, like a well-trained dog. But of course, it doesn't. The dead pile up faster than the grave diggers can work. Soon, the diggers themselves are gone. Priests die mid-sermon. Families disappear overnight. You stand in a village square where the only sound is the buzzing of flies. You swear you hear moaning in the distance, but you're not sure if it's human. And then, in a twist only medieval history could provide, hygiene suddenly becomes a luxury again. The rich flee to the countryside, where the air is cleaner, or at least smells like sheep instead of rot. They build privy houses at their manors, digging deep pits and wiping with imported cloth. Some even have servants wipe for them, believing touch from another is protective. You try to pretend you didn't hear that. In cities, however, it's chaos. The gong farmers, those noble souls who clean out cesspits, are now some of the most important and most feared workers in the community. They wear long leather coats, masks soaked in vinegar, and carry torches to burn methane fumes before entering waste pits. Some claim to be immune to the plague because of their exposure to filth. You meet one named Hal who laughs in your face and says, "I haven't smelled a flower since my 10th birthday." Meanwhile, religious sects debate whether God is punishing people for neglecting cleanliness or indulging in too much of it. Some saints' relics are carried through towns, others buried in mass graves. Hospitals, if they can be called that, begin enforcing rules. Clean straw only. Wash hands between touching patients. Dispose of soiled linens in fire pits. For the first time, you hear someone say contagion with something like understanding. But even now, with death all around them, most people still don't connect disease to wiping practices. They fear breath, not hands. Odors, not rags. There's one bright spot, oddly enough. Soap makers. Previously seen as slightly suspicious, they used animal fats and strange herbs. They now become vital. Soap sales soar. Recipes are guarded like treasure. You watch as a woman mixes ash, lye, and lavender into a thick paste, muttering the Lord's Prayer as she stirs. She offers you a lump. You take it like it's gold. And yes, people begin to bathe again. Cautiously, secretly. But bathhouses reopen in some towns, now with strict rules, 1 person per tub, fresh herbs each time, and extra payment for scourging oils. You don't ask. By the end of the plague, the world is different, not better. Not cleaner, exactly. But people have learned, slowly, painfully, that filth has consequences. Not everyone connects that to their personal wiping cloth, but a few do. Manuals begin to circulate. Advice is given. Do not eat with soiled hands, one suggests. Wipe toward the back, not the front, says another. Blunt and rare honesty in a world still clinging to euphemisms. You leave the village as dusk falls. The scent of burning herbs lingers in your hair. You're grateful to be alive, grateful not to be hauling a corpse cart, and, strangely, grateful for the small lump of soap in your pocket. Because the Black Death didn't invent sanitation, but it did something perhaps more powerful. It made people wish they had it. You've seen what plague can do to a society teetering on the edge of chaos. How fear magnifies filth. How desperation turns moss into luxury. But tonight, let's take a gentler detour. No shrieking town criers, no mass graves, no chamber pots teetering out of windows. Just a little stroll through the quieter side of history, because long before anyone dreamed of ultra-soft triple-ply rolls, people still had to wipe, and they got creative. Welcome to Section 11, Toilet Paper's Ancient Cousins. You're walking through the ruins of an old Roman villa. Vines creep through crumbling walls. A breeze carries the scent of cypress trees and something oddly medicinal. And as you step into what was once a public bathhouse, you come face to face with one of humanity's oldest friends and occasional foe. The communal sponge on a stick. Yes, it was real. And no, you didn't mishear the word communal. In Roman times, particularly in latrines, it was common to keep a tersorium, a wooden stick with a sea sponge tied to the end, sitting in a bucket of vinegar or salt water. After doing your business on a long shared bench with open holes and very little shame, you'd give yourself a swipe, rinse the sponge, and leave it for the next person. You're horrified, but also a little impressed. Hygiene aside, it's kind of ingenious. Reusable, effective, eco-conscious, just not, pleasant. And here's the thing, they weren't alone. Across the world and throughout history, humanity came up with an astonishing variety of wiping tools, many of which, weirdly, make a lot of sense. In ancient China, early records show the use of paper for hygiene as far back as the 6th century. Not for calligraphy or poetry, specifically for wiping. It wasn't the plush kind, mind you. More like coarse, recycled bamboo pulp. But still, it beat moss. By the 14th century, the Chinese emperor's court reportedly ordered sheets of toilet paper in quantities of 720,000 per year, cut to a very specific size, 2 feet by 3 feet. You marvel at the image of royal attendants delicately stacking a mountain of squares while a scribe checks the dimensions. Bureaucracy truly is eternal. In Japan, there was something called the chuji, a slender bamboo stick used not just for cleaning, but for stimulating the bowels, like a sort of ancient medical tool. You make a mental note to never ask follow-up questions. In Islamic cultures, there's the use of stones and water, with detailed instructions in religious texts about cleanliness. And not just any stone, ideally smooth, dry, and in odd numbers. Wiping 3 times was considered best practice. Somehow this feels more thoughtful than most medieval European efforts. In India, water has long been central to post-elimination hygiene. The lota, a small water vessel, was, and still is, used for cleaning with the left hand, hence the ongoing custom of reserving the left hand for, non-food-related activities. You glance down at your own left hand, suddenly self-conscious. And then there's Northern Europe, where peat moss, hay, and even discarded wool scraps were commonly used. Poor families sometimes resorted to corn cobs, the original multi-tool. Surprisingly effective, if slightly exfoliating. One traveler in the 13th century described seeing Arctic peoples use snowballs as a wiping agent. Fresh, cooling, biodegradable, though one can only imagine the shock during the first swipe. You pause beside an old tree and notice a familiar sight. Leaves, soft, broad ones, not too dry, not too glossy. The kind of leaf that medieval folks sought out on every journey. You run your fingers across the surface. A simple, ancient solution. No branding, no quilted mascots. Just whatever the forest was offering that day. And still, despite all this creativity, actual toilet paper, as you know it, didn't make its grand entrance until centuries later. 1857 to be precise, when an American named Joseph Gaiety marketed sheets of medicated paper as the greatest necessity of the age. Each sheet even had his name printed on it. That's right, the first branded toilet paper was proudly labeled, like a business card you could never reuse. But in the 1300s, none of that existed, and yet somehow people wiped, cleaned, lived, and carried on. You sit down beside a quiet stream. The moonlight ripples over the water. Somewhere in the trees, an owl calls. You realize something oddly comforting. No matter the culture, no matter the era, everyone dealt with the same basic problem, and they all found a way. Some with leaves, some with snow, some, unfortunately, with sponges that had seen far too much. There's something beautifully equalizing about that. Tonight, you won't dream of plague or privy laws. You'll dream of a world where everyone's just trying to stay a little bit cleaner, one strange method at a time. You have wandered through forests of fig leaves, past imperial sponge buckets, and across plague-swept courtyards. You've seen how wiping evolved, or didn't, depending on geography, class, and desperation. But tonight, let's pull back the tapestry a bit. Let's take a long, uncomfortable look at who was actually responsible for cleaning it all up. Welcome to Section 12. The servants who had to handle it. It's early morning in a manor house. You're awakened not by bird song, but by the gentle clatter of metal, followed by a grunt, and then the unmistakable sound of liquid being poured into a wooden bucket. It's warm, it's foul, it's very much not water. That, dear traveler, is the chamber pot being emptied. And the person doing the emptying? That's Ellen, the scullery maid. She's 14, smells like ash and cabbage, and is responsible for half a dozen noble backsides. She does not look thrilled to see you, because while the lords and ladies are fussing with powdered wigs, Ellen is hauling buckets of human waste down narrow stone staircases and out into a freezing courtyard. Her reward? A bowl of gruel and the occasional leftover crust. You offer to carry one of the pots. She laughs in a way that's not entirely kind. "You wouldn't last a day, soft hands," she says, and you're forced to admit she's probably right. In the medieval world, waste management fell squarely on the shoulders of the lowest ranks. Servants, apprentices, orphan boys, and yes, even women, especially in large households, were tasked with cleaning chamber pots, scrubbing privy seats, replacing straw in communal latrines, and in some cases, removing solid waste with a wooden spatula. That's right. The first people to scrape the bottom did it literally. You trail Ellen out to the edge of the estate, where she dumps the contents into a trench known as the midden. A designated waste pit surrounded by flies, rats, and a smell that could peel bark off trees. It bubbles ominously. You pretend not to notice. But the manor has it easy compared to cities. In the town square, you meet Tobe, a man in his 50s who proudly calls himself a gong farmer. This, in case it needs explaining, is the person hired to dig out cesspits and latrine vaults. Only at night, only by torchlight, only after everyone else has gone to bed. He wears heavy leather boots, a thick apron, and a look of permanent resignation. "Been in deeper than any priest," he tells you, jabbing a long-handled shovel into the muck. "Seen things God won't even look at." You believe him. Gong farmers often made good money, dangerous, back-breaking, soul-sapping money. But the social price was steep. They were avoided, pitied, and sometimes feared, as if their contact with waste made them unclean in more than just the physical sense. Toby lives alone. He eats outside, even in the rain. No one wants to share a table with the man who smells like every privy from here to Canterbury. And yet, without him, the whole city would collapse into an ankle-deep swamp of its own making. Back at the manor, Ellen has moved on to the laundry. Linen cloths, some used for wiping, are being boiled in an iron pot over a low fire. The water turns grey, then brown. The smell is indescribable. But cloth was expensive. It had to be reused. So Ellen rinses, scrubs with lye soap, wrings them out, and hangs them by the fire to dry. You wonder if they're ever truly clean. She shrugs. Clean enough, she says. Better than last week. You start to notice just how many people it takes to maintain even basic decency in this world. One noble's bathroom habits require a half-dozen hands to support. Carrying the pot, washing the cloth, scrubbing the stool, airing the rushes. An entire invisible army, ensuring no one of status has to deal with their own dirt. And here's a little-known truth. Servants often had better instincts about hygiene than their employers. They were the ones who washed their hands after emptying pots. They learned not to reuse cloths until they were dry. Some even created primitive schedules for waste removal, marking the walls with charcoal to remember which chamber hadn't been cleaned. You meet a young boy named Finn whose only job is to stir the privy trench once a week so it doesn't overflow. You ask if he ever forgets. He blinks at you like you've asked whether the sun ever forgets to rise. If I forget, he says, we all drown. Point taken. And of course, there were rules. Unwritten, but deeply felt. Servants never touched noble undergarments without gloves, or wiped with cloth unless it had been approved for that purpose. Pot handles were held with cloth. No one stepped barefoot into the washing room, ever. And no matter how close a servant came to the noble body, they were expected to remain invisible. Which leads us to a disturbing irony. In a world obsessed with class, the dirtiest work was often done with the most care. The lowest-ranked people had the highest standards because they had to. Because they couldn't afford mistakes. Because they were always one mess away from punishment or dismissal. You sit beside Ellen at the end of the day. Her hands are raw. Her clothes are damp. She offers you a bite of her bread and you realize you don't deserve it. Tomorrow I get to scrub the garderobe stairs, she says, almost cheerfully. Nice change from laundry. You smile, weakly. Because in the 1300s, survival isn't just about what you wipe with. It's about who's doing the wiping and who's expected to pretend it never happened. You've followed the servants who carry the mess, the nobles who create it, and the plague that made everyone rethink their relationship with anything remotely smelly. But there's still one place, one almost magical realm, that offered the promise of warmth, water, and maybe even cleanliness. That place, the public bathhouse. Welcome to Section 13. What went wrong with bathhouses? It's evening now. The streets are quiet, save for the occasional cart wheel rattle or a dog sniffing a suspicious puddle. But just up ahead, through a timber-framed doorway, comes light, flickering, warm, and scented faintly with herbs. You step inside and are immediately greeted by steam and voices and naked people. A lot of them. Because in the 1300s, public bathhouses weren't weird. They were wonderful. For a brief, shining period of medieval history, many towns had at least one bathhouse. Some had dozens, and they weren't reserved for the rich. Bakers, cobblers, widows, monks all came to wash. And soak, and gossip. Tonight you're at one of the better ones, a 2-story timber building with plaster walls and a tiled roof, heated by fires stoked in the basement. Inside are wooden tubs, Buckets of hot and cold water, bowls of lavender, rosemary, even bits of lye soap floating in grease. The bath attendant hands you a towel, generously described, points you toward an empty tub and says, "Mind the splinters." You ease in. Bliss. For the first time in what feels like centuries, you feel warm all the way to your bones. The ache in your legs eases. The muck under your nails softens. You start to believe in miracles. But of course, there's a catch. Bath houses in the 1300s weren't just about bathing. They were also about socializing, eating, and sometimes a little extracurricular activity. They were cozy, dimly lit, and private. Men and women often bathed together. Modesty was optional. Courtesans worked out of some bath houses, and for many, the line between spa day and suspicious encounter became hazy, especially after wine. Naturally, the church wasn't thrilled. You hear the local priest complaining outside the door, denouncing the moral decay wafting from within. "These bath houses are dens of vice," he bellows, "and nudity leads to sin." You notice he's holding a towel himself. Curious. But religious disapproval wasn't the biggest issue. The problem was disease. When the plague hit, public spaces became terrifying. People didn't understand germs, but they understood proximity. They saw that people who visited bath houses sometimes didn't come back. And just like that, the idea of soaking in warm water beside strangers lost its charm. Suddenly, bathing became suspicious. Some claimed that warm water opened the pores, letting in sickness. Others whispered that bathhouse attendants were secretly spreading disease. Accusations flew. Cities closed the bathhouses until further notice. That notice never came. You hear about one in Paris that was converted into a jail. Another in Florence became a warehouse. A third in London was just abandoned. Straw replaced water. Buckets replaced tubs. The age of the bathhouse was over, and with it, the fragile momentum of medieval cleanliness evaporated. You sit in your now lukewarm tub and listen to a man in the next stall talk about the old days. "Used to come here every week," he says. "Scrubbed clean, shaved my beard, even got me toenails looked at." He sighs. Now it's all ashcloth and vinegar water. You can't help but mourn the loss of something so human. A place to gather, to rest, to feel a little less filthy, even if only for a few hours. A place where even the poorest laborer could pretend, just briefly, that their skin belonged to someone important. Of course, not everything was perfect. Tubs weren't always rinsed. Towels weren't exactly sanitary. And the water, reused more than you'd like to think. You hear one woman proudly say she was third in line for the big tub today, as if that's a prize. Still, compared to wiping with a snowball behind a pigsty, this feels almost luxurious. But now, bathhouses are fading. The building creaks. The water is cooling. The attendant says they'll close soon. For good. And as you dress and step back into the cold night, you feel a quiet shift. This was the turning point. Not the sponge, not the plague, but this loss of public bathing, this retreat from water, became the real beginning of Europe's dirtier centuries. From here on out, people will start to avoid water. Washing will be a rarity. Perfume will replace soap. Lace will cover grime. And instead of improving sanitation, the world will just ignore it. For a while, anyway. But for now, you wrap yourself tighter in your cloak, feeling cleaner than you've been in days. You carry the memory of warmth like a secret. Because tonight, you learned something important. The Middle Ages knew how to get clean. They just couldn't agree on whether they should. So far, You've soaked in bathhouse glory, met the unsung heroes of waste removal, and learned why rosemary isn't just for roast chicken. But now it's time to give credit where it's due. Because for all the jokes about medieval filth, people in the 1300s weren't entirely clueless. In fact, some of them were weirdly good at toilet technology. Welcome to Section 14. The medieval toilet tech you didn't expect. You're standing in a castle. Not the kind with fairy tale turrets and polite dragons, but a hulking stone fortress. Cold, damp, and surprisingly drafty. You follow your nose, and the breeze, to a narrow passage tucked along the outer wall. There, you discover a small stone seat built right into the thickness of the wall itself. A perfect little rectangle perched several meters above the moat. You found it. A garderobe. It's a medieval toilet, in all its glory, a chute that leads directly out of the building, usually over open air, sometimes into a river, sometimes just onto a slope where the chickens peck suspiciously. You step closer, not too close, and notice a groove worn smooth by centuries of noble behinds. Imagine it, a knight in shining armor, pausing mid-siege for a very human break. He unlatches his codpiece, sighs dramatically, and stares out at the horizon while the waist plummets to freedom. The name garderobe comes from the French to guard robes. And yes, sometimes clothes were literally stored near these chutes because people believed the ammonia fumes killed lice. That's right, your fancy cloak might have hung right above a medieval poop pipe. Charming, but it gets better. Some castles had double-decker garderobes, so two people could use the chute, one above the other. There was usually a stone divider. Usually. You don't want to think about the exceptions. In cities, the tech could get surprisingly sophisticated. Take Tournai, Belgium, for example. Archaeologists uncovered stone-lined public latrines with water channels that flushed waste away. Real running water, powered by gravity, of course, but still effective. Monasteries were often ahead of the game, too. Monks valued cleanliness and silence. So many cloisters had long latrine houses with seating for a dozen or more, all suspended above flowing streams. Quiet, functional, and communal. You picture a line of silent monks, robes lifted, all facing the same wall in meditative stillness. A scene equal parts peaceful and deeply awkward, and then there's the gong farmer's access hatch. Cleverly hidden doors at the base of castles or city homes that allowed waste collectors to scoop out the pits below without disturbing the user experience upstairs. You pause by one of these hatches now. Just a small wooden door. Innocuous. Unless you know. 3 feet deep and twice as wide, says a passing stable hand. Takes hours to dig out. Smells like something that shouldn't exist. He's not wrong. But even beyond buildings, medieval folks were thinking creatively. In some wealthier homes, they used boarded chamber pots with lids, which sounds unremarkable, until you remember most peasants were squatting behind barns. Some pots were ceramic, others pewter or even carved wood with inlaid patterns, because nothing says elegance like floral designs on a portable toilet. You see one now on a shelf in a merchant's house, a wooden seat with a hollow base, painted with vines and birds. You resist the urge to ask if it's decorative or in active use. There were also travel privies, basically portable stools with a hole in the middle and a bucket underneath, perfect for nobles on the go. Imagine a carriage lurching through muddy roads while the Duchess attempts to hover with dignity. Heroic, really. But let's not forget the toilet paper alternatives, which had a kind of genius to them. Some homes kept a dedicated wipe stick, a smooth wooden rod wrapped with cloth or moss, used and cleaned between each use. Inconvenient. Sure, but it kept hands out of harm's way. Some monasteries even had written records of wiping protocols, which hand to use, which direction to wipe, and the preferred number of passes. It's like OSHA, but for butts. So yes, while the peasants were still crouching in ditches with leaves and prayers, parts of medieval society were embracing surprisingly decent sanitation systems. You might be thinking, wait, if they had chutes and running water and wiping sticks, why didn't things improve faster? Ah, that's the medieval paradox. Because for every thoughtful invention, there were 10 reasons it didn't catch on. Expense, superstition, weather, a strong tradition of doing things the hard way, and the simple fact that most people didn't build castles or monasteries. They just lived beside them, squinting at the stone walls and wiping with bark. Still, it's worth remembering that even in the darkest corners of the 1300s, people were trying to build, to manage, to make something better, however crude, however smelly. As the evening chill settles in and the breeze from the garderobe tickles your nose, you whisper a quiet word of thanks to the forgotten engineers, masons and chambermaids who made going to the bathroom slightly less terrible for everyone else. You've seen how castles had poop chutes, monks had flushing streams, and peasants had, well, whatever they could find. But surely the kings and queens of the 1300s, those glittering symbols of wealth and divine authority, must have had something better, something grand, something golden. Well, yes, and also no. Welcome to Section 15, How Royalty Used the Restroom. You're inside a royal palace now. Stone walls, thick tapestries, the scent of beeswax and boiled meat hanging in the air. Every surface is adorned, gilded, embroidered. Even the toilet is trying to impress you. Technically, it's not called a toilet. It's called a close stool. And what a stool it is. A wooden chair with an upholstered seat, velvet if you're lucky, conceals a chamber pot beneath a hinged lid. The royale behind rests on velvet while business is conducted below. You could say it's the original throne, and you wouldn't be wrong. But here's the truly astonishing part. They didn't go alone. Enter the groom of the stool. Yes, that was a real job title. And no, it was not a punishment. In fact, it was one of the most trusted and prestigious positions in the royal household. You turn a corner and see him, tidy, serious, wearing a very crisp tunic and carrying what appears to be a damp cloth and a small book. He's not just here to clean, he's here to record. Because part of the groom's duty, besides assisting the monarch with wiping, dressing, and disposal, was to keep daily notes on royal bowel movements, texture, frequency, color. Because nothing says divine right of kings like a documented history of constipation. Of course, it wasn't just about hygiene, it was about trust. The groom of the stool had private access to the king when he was most vulnerable, most human. That meant political power, influence, secrets whispered mid-wipe. One day he's holding the linen, the next he's arranging royal marriages. Meanwhile, the queen had her own arrangements. Ladies-in-waiting assisted her with clothing, bathing, and yes, bathroom needs. Privacy was a foreign concept. What mattered was modesty, plenty of drapery, layers, and soft voices. You peek into Queen Isabella's private chambers. There, hidden behind a curtain embroidered with golden griffins, sits a delicate close stool draped in silk. Next to it, a small basin of rose water and a tray of folded cloths, some embroidered with tiny crowns. You are both impressed and horrified, but not all royalty sat in splendor. When traveling, kings and queens had portable privies, carried by servants or mounted in carriages. Some were collapsible. Others were fixed into carved boxes that doubled as seats during long negotiations. Picture a king declaring war while perched above a carefully placed pot. The dignity is debatable. You meet a valet named Omri who's in charge of the royal elimination schedule. He's very proud of his work. He prefers to go after meat pie, Omri explains, but never before falconry. You nod as though this makes perfect sense. And what did they wipe with? Now we're getting fancy. Royalty used soft linens, often perfumed. Some accounts mention cloths soaked in rosewater, musk, or citrus oil. Wiping wasn't just practical, it was ritual. The Queen of France allegedly insisted her cloths be warmed before use. You try not to think about the logistics. For the very wealthy, hygiene became a performance of status. Kings might be bathed by 4 servants, one to pour water, one to lather, one to rinse, and one to hold up a scented towel. They didn't wash often, mind you, but when they did, it was with flair. You also hear stories about disposable wipes made of finely shredded linen. One court in Burgundy burned used cloth daily, not out of cleanliness, but to prevent scandalous reuse by unscrupulous staff. Apparently, the black market for noble butt cloth was real. And yet, despite all this elegance, the royal toilet was still a bucket under a chair. There was no plumbing, no suction, no button. Just a very heavy pot, often made of pewter or silver, which a servant had to remove, clean, and, if they were unlucky, carry through the banquet hall at just the wrong time. Imagine a feast, lutes strumming, candles flickering, wine flowing, and then a footman trudging past with a sloshing royal chamber pot, trying very hard not to spill on the venison. Because in the end, no matter how rich you were, nature made you equal. Even kings had indigestion. Even queens had unfortunate timing. Even the most perfumed linen couldn't disguise certain realities. And so, as you leave the palace, stepping carefully around a suspicious puddle near the stables, you carry with you a new appreciation. Not for the splendor of royal life, but for the quiet, underpaid servants who kept it running, and for the knowledge that, velvet seat or not, everyone still had to sit down and deal with it. You've seen the throne rooms and the garderobes, the velvet-covered stools of kings and the vinegar-soaked cloths of commoners. But if we really want to understand the 1300s, we need to step out of castles and cloisters and walk back down the muddy track to the heart of medieval society, the village. Because while nobles sat on cushioned stools and scribes argued about wiping angles, the people who made up most of the population, the peasants, were down in the dirt, quite literally, doing their business wherever they could. Welcome to Section 16, Peasants and the Politics of Poop. It's dawn, and the fog hangs low over the fields. You shuffle through the farmyard, past chickens scratching for breakfast and a pig giving you a look that feels suspiciously judgmental. Behind a leaning fence, you spot a wooden outhouse. You approach. It is an experience. The outhouse is a rickety box of rough planks with a hole cut into a wooden bench, perched above a shallow pit that someone definitely forgot to dig deeper. It smells like something unholy crawled in and decided to stay. There's no door, just a scrap of wool cloth flapping in the wind. Privacy if you're lucky. A wasp in the wrong place if you're not. But here's the truth. Even this was a luxury. Many peasants didn't have outhouses. They went wherever they could, behind barns, in fields, in the forest. At night, chamber pots were used if you had one. Otherwise, you might just open the cottage door and hope the chickens didn't mind. The floor of a peasant hut might be made of packed earth mixed with straw and ash. A corner might be designated as a night soil spot, especially during storms. If you've ever wondered why medieval cottages often smelled of smoke, sweat, and something else, that something else is likely the pile of waste fermenting under the bed. But there was a method to the madness. Kind of. Some villages had communal dung heaps or pits dug outside the perimeter, and it was expected, though not enforced, that people dispose of waste there. These heaps were also used for animal dung, food scraps, broken tools, and occasionally dead rats. It was recycling, medieval style. And what about wiping? For peasants, it was anything that came to hand. Rags, moss, hay, twigs, feathers, smooth stones. In autumn, leaves were great. In winter, you got creative. One man proudly shows you his reusable wiping cloth, which he rinses in the stream daily and hangs near the hearth to dry. His wife says she doesn't touch it. Smart woman. There's something both practical and utterly chaotic about it all. There were no manuals, no standard etiquette, and certainly no instruction from the church, who were too busy worrying about dancing on Sundays to care about your wiping technique. But here's where it gets surprisingly complex. Even waste had politics. Landlords controlled everything, what you could grow, where you could walk, and yes, where you could relieve yourself. Some even charged tenants extra if they wanted to dig a proper latrine pit. Others forbade it entirely, fearing it would spoil the soil or attract rats to the manor's edge. You meet an old man named Wulfric who tells you, with some bitterness, that the only place he was allowed to go as a child was behind the smithy after dark, and only if you didn't step on the cat. You try not to laugh. He's still mad about it. Meanwhile, city peasants had their own challenges. Crammed into tenements with narrow alleys, they used chamber pots and flung the contents out windows, ideally with a shout of "Gardy-loo" to warn passers-by. Many didn't bother with the shout. Streets were often slick with human and animal waste. The phrase, "Don't wear your best shoes," wasn't a fashion tip. It was survival advice. And let's not forget that waste disposal was taxed. Some towns imposed fees on gong farmers and dung carriers, which meant that poorer residents sometimes had to bribe them to collect their waste or risk it piling up dangerously close to their homes. There's even evidence of peasant protests over manure collection. You wouldn't believe how many historical documents include the phrase unauthorized dung dumping. Still, despite the filth and the indignity, peasants were remarkably resilient. They taught their children how to squat properly, how to avoid using poison ivy, very important, and how to recognize the signs of a bad pit. You don't want to know. One woman proudly shows you her outhouse. Fresh straw on the floor, a bouquet of dried lavender by the seat, and a sign carved with "God sees all." You ask if that includes bowel movements. She smiles and shrugs. I hope not. And in moments like that, you start to see the humanity. Because behind the stereotypes and the stench, these were people doing their best with what they had. They invented systems, they taught their kids, they navigated feudal rules with sharp eyes and sharper humor. And somehow, they kept going. You sit by a field as dusk falls, watching a shepherd carefully choose a spot near the edge of the trees. He glances back, sees you watching, and gives a theatrical bow. "Tell your grand lords," he says, "we wipe with pride." And maybe, just maybe, that's the most medieval thing of all. You have now trudged through the alleyways of urban squalor, perched on castle guard robes, and admired the artistic embroidery of royal toilet cloths. But we haven't yet explored what happens after everything's been dumped, flung, flushed, or buried. Because in the 1300s, waste didn't just disappear. It was used. Welcome to Section 17, Night Soil and Medieval Fertilizer Secrets. It's early morning again, and the dew is still clinging to the cabbage leaves. You follow a bent old farmer down a narrow path, where the fields stretch wide and green beneath the mist. The soil is dark, rich, healthy, and it smells like yesterday's dinner. If yesterday's dinner had been eaten, digested, and enthusiastically ejected by half the village. This, my friend, is night soil, a polite term for human waste collected, yes, usually at night, and used as fertilizer. While it may sound unsanitary to modern ears, to the medieval farmer, this was precious stuff. Nutrient-rich, abundant, free. You watch as a boy with strong arms and no sense of smell sloshes bucketfuls into furrows between turnips. He whistles while he works. You wonder how. The idea wasn't new. Civilizations had been using human waste as fertilizer for centuries. In China, Japan, and the Islamic world, it was systematized and regulated. But in medieval Europe, things were a bit more enthusiastic than structured. In towns, gong farmers and nightmen, you remember Tobe, don't you? Collected waste from latrines, cesspits, and chamber pots and carted it outside the city limits. Sometimes they dumped it into rivers, but often, especially in agricultural regions, they sold it to farmers. Imagine that, waste collected by the bucket, then transported miles out of town, only to be carefully spread on barley fields and bean rows. Recycling before it was trendy. You hear one farmer boast that he can smell a good crop 2 months before it sprouts. You make a mental note to never take gardening advice from him. And it wasn't just human waste. Animal dung, urine, ashes, straw, and kitchen scraps all went into the mix. Some even collected soot from chimneys to sweeten the soil. It was composting, but aggressive. In monasteries, monks kept compost records, tracking what went into each garden bed and how the plants responded. One abbot wrote about mixing goose droppings with lime to grow more fragrant herbs. Another insisted that the third fermentation of dung water brings forth the most holy turnip. Theological opinions varied, and the most prized additive? Urine. You're handed a jug of yellowish liquid by a cheerful maid named Sabina. "We call it chamber gold," she says brightly. "Let it sit 2 weeks, and it's good for onions, leeks, and husbands with thin hair." Urine was rich in nitrogen and ammonia. Letting it ferment created alkaline salts that acted as both a fertilizer and a cleaning agent. It was also used to bleach wool, tan leather, and even treat wounds. Yes, wounds. No one said the 1300s were boring, but back to the fields. Once night soil was applied, it was often covered with mulch, straw, peat, or ash, to reduce the smell and avoid the attention of rats, flies, and a passing nobility with sensitive noses. It worked. Sometime. You meet a merchant who tried to export night soil-enriched hay to another village. The shipment was refused due to spiritual odor concerns. He's still mad about it. The risk, of course, was contamination. People didn't understand bacteria, but they knew that bad smells led to bad humors. So they didn't always eat vegetables fertilized with human waste right away. They often cooked or boiled them thoroughly, sometimes soaking them in vinegar first. Whether this helped is up for debate. In fact, historians still argue over just how harmful night soil was. Some say it spread disease. Others argue that careful handling and fermentation time made it mostly safe. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But either way, it was necessary. Because artificial fertilizers didn't exist. Manure from animals wasn't always enough, and for a peasant family relying on one plot of land to feed 7 people through winter, a few buckets of human compost could mean the difference between hunger and survival. So, while nobility wrinkled their noses and city priests warned about unholy stinks, peasants kept hauling, pouring, mixing, and planting. You watch an old woman scatter dried dung pellets around her beetroot patch. Her hands are gnarled, her shawl patched with wool scraps, but her rows are straight and her harvests are strong. This, she says, patting the ground proudly, came from last year's festival stew. You try to smile, you really do. But tonight, as you rest near the edge of the field, the air full of the warm, earthy scent of medieval fertilizer, you can't help but admire the efficiency of it all. In a world with no plastic, no plumbing, and no margin for waste, they found a way to use everything. Even what we'd rather forget, and when the sun sets and the cabbages whisper softly in the breeze, you'll find yourself strangely soothed by the knowledge that someone, somewhere, is still out there with a bucket and a plan. By now, you've accepted that the Middle Ages were messy, but ingenious. You've seen how waste was hauled, reused, composted, even tracked by royal scribes. But tonight, we venture into a different realm. A world where relieving yourself wasn't just necessary. It was mysterious, risky, and sometimes downright cursed. Welcome to Section 18, the strange superstitions around. Going number 2, it's midnight. You're crouched behind a hedgerow because someone told you not to use the privy after dark. Why? They didn't say. They just crossed themselves and muttered something about the things that live below. You assume they meant rats. You are wrong. Because in the 1300s, bodily functions weren't just private. They were spiritual. Every belch, sneeze, or, yes, bowel movement could be read as an omen. And emptying your insides. That was seen by many as a moment of vulnerability, when your soul might slip out if you weren't careful. You shift uncomfortably. Let's start with the basics. Many believed that evil spirits lingered in privies. The dark, the smell, the echoes. It was the perfect place for demons to skulk. Some said you should say a prayer before squatting, just in case something decided to crawl up the other way. You know, just in case. Others tied a protective charm to the belt or the privy door. It might be a carved rune, a tiny cross, or a pouch of herbs. Rosemary, sage, and wormwood being especially popular. Not to block the smell, mind you, but to repel the devil. In fact, the act of sitting down to go was sometimes accompanied by a short rhyme. As I sit to make me light, let no dark come take my sight. Charming. And speaking of darkness, midnight pooping was strongly discouraged. Not just for practical reasons, pits were hard to see and you really didn't want to misjudge your footing, but because supernatural creatures were said to lurk nearby. Sprites, boggarts, will-o'-the-wisps. You name it, someone blamed it for stealing a child or a chamber pot. You meet a shepherd who swears he once saw glowing eyes in the night soil pit. He says they blinked at him. You choose not to ask what he'd been drinking. Meanwhile, some women believed that pregnant women shouldn't relieve themselves near running water, for fear it would pull the child downward. Others said that loud farts could summon bad weather, which is both hilarious and deeply inconvenient for anyone with beans. Oh, and never, ever wipe with a black cat's hair. Yes, this was actually recorded as a warning in a French rural superstition manual. Not only was it bad luck, it could bring plague, which is a very high-stakes wiping mistake. But the fear wasn't just supernatural. There were also moral rules about bathroom behavior. Some religious figures preached that thinking sinful thoughts while relieving yourself could open the soul to temptation. Others believed that God might withhold relief as punishment for gluttony or pride, which led to some strange remedies. You overhear a nun advising a farmer on his constipation. Confess your arrogance, and the Lord will loosen your bowels. He looks skeptical. She's very serious. In certain towns, public accidents, say slipping in the street after someone dumped a chamber pot, were seen as signs of divine judgment. A bad fall? You'd better confess your sins. A good stain? Repent now, and let's not forget dreams. Dreaming of going to the bathroom was believed to be symbolic. To pass waste in a dream might mean you were letting go of envy, or greed. Or, if you dreamed of not being able to go, it could mean you were spiritually blocked. You meet a village dream interpreter named Digna, who carries a pouch of dried dung beads and a book of Latin scribbles. She charges 1 chicken per consultation. You pass. Still, not every superstition was terrifying. Some believed that the first poop of a newborn held magical properties. Midwives might wrap it in cloth and bury it under the hearth to protect the baby's soul. Others claimed it could be used in love potions, though no one seems eager to test that theory. There were even bathroom blessings. Short phrases spoken before or after relieving yourself, thanking the body for working properly. You hear a woodcutter mutter one now. Praise be to the Lord who opened the gate and let the storm pass gently. You try not to laugh. It's oddly poetic. As you head back toward the village, the moon casting a silver glow over the trees, you find yourself strangely aware of your own steps, of how vulnerable you are, even now. The 1300s didn't have light switches or hand sanitizer, but they had centuries of folklore built around keeping your body safe, even when doing the most ordinary thing in the world. Because in an unpredictable, disease-ridden, spiritually charged world, even poop had rules. You've heard from kings and monks, farmers and dream readers, but now it's time to lower the stakes, literally. Because tonight we're looking at the smallest members of medieval society and how they learned to navigate the murky, messy world of hygiene. Welcome to section 19. How children were potty trained in the 1300s. The village is waking up again, and you find yourself outside a modest cottage where a small child is waddling toward a suspicious corner of the yard. His mother yells something in Middle English, half warning, half encouragement, and rushes over with a bucket. You've arrived just in time for a lesson in medieval potty training. Now, let's get one thing straight. There were no cartoon-themed training seats, no reward charts, no tiny toilet paper rolls with cheerful hedgehogs. What there was, mostly, was urgency. Because in a world where waste was already hard to manage, having a child leave surprise puddles on the packed earth floor was a health hazard and an olfactory nightmare. So parents got creative. Fast. Some infants were encouraged to go outdoors from a very early age. This was called elimination communication, though no one would have called it that. You just watched your baby closely, learned the signals, and whisked them outside or over a bucket the moment they made that face. A midwife named Rosa proudly tells you, "My youngest went in the grass from 5 moons onward." Never soiled a blanket again. Her eldest, she adds with a frown, was stubborn. You peek inside and spot a small wooden chamber pot, carved with cheerful flowers. It's clearly for children. Light enough to carry, shallow enough to clean. Some were shaped like tiny stools. Others were just ceramic bowls passed down through generations. Some households used training benches, long planks with small cutouts for children to sit on side by side, while the parent supervised from nearby. It was communal, it was practical, and it made for extremely awkward sibling memories. But of course, not everything went smoothly. Accidents were common. So were gentle bribes, a spoonful of honey if you go in the pot, or a story if you try your best. Some parents sang songs about the benefits of letting go properly. Others relied on scare tactics. You hear one boy whisper to his sister, "If you pee on the floor, the chamber demons will lick your toes at night." She goes silent. You silently applaud his creativity. Cultural expectations varied. In noble households, children might wear cloth nappies, diapers made from linen, tied with woolen cords. These were reused, scrubbed with lye soap and hung to dry. In peasant homes, many babies simply wore long tunics and nothing underneath. You pass one toddler toddling gleefully through the mud, clearly free and unbothered. His mother shrugs. He'll learn. When he sits in it, he learns faster. Potty training wasn't just about neatness. It was about readiness for work. A child who could relieve themselves properly could spend longer hours in the fields, the kitchen, or carrying water. It was one of the first signs that a child was growing up. And for children learning to help in waste management, yes, they existed. The training was even more intense. A 10-year-old boy might carry a chamber pot for a grandmother. A girl might help empty the night buckets into the garden pit. You could say potty training was just the warm-up for a life full of very practical responsibilities. One thing that's surprisingly absent: shame. In the 1300s, bodily functions were inconvenient, sometimes smelly, occasionally dangerous, but not taboo. You didn't get sent to therapy for an accident. You got rinsed off with vinegar water, handed a clean tunic and told to aim better next time. Even religious teachings focused more on discipline than guilt. One monk's manual for raising children suggested praising a child's efforts when they go clean, and warned that harsh scolding would bind the gut with fear, which is both literal and strangely modern. Still, some families added a little flair. You meet a grandmother who gives her grandchildren a blessing bowl after their first successful week without accidents. It's filled with dried plums, rose petals, and a carved token shaped like a little goose. She winks and says, "Nothing teaches quicker than pride." So, if you were a child in the 1300s, you learned quickly where to go, when to go, and most importantly, where not to go. Under the Lord's table? Bad. Behind the altar? Very bad. Into your father's only pair of boots? Absolutely catastrophic. But with patience, routine, and a steady supply of wash buckets, even the youngest peasant found their way. And as you watch the little boy from earlier proudly plop himself onto his carved pot with the confidence of a king, you realize, no matter the century, the milestones that make us human haven't changed much. So, here we are. You've walked beside chambermaids and kings, peasants and monks, night soil men and barefoot toddlers. You've hovered over garderobes, peeked inside rotting outhouses, and politely declined a fermented urine demonstration. But as the story winds down, it's time to look ahead, or rather, at how it all began to end. Welcome to Section 20, the end of the Privy Age. It's the late 1300s now. The fields are turning gold. Villages are rebuilding after waves of plague, war, and famine. And quietly, very quietly, a change is beginning to burble beneath the surface. Literally, you hear it first in cities. The whisper of water running under stone, the clunk of wooden valves, and the creak of something new. A system. Still primitive, still patchy, but undeniably there. It starts in monasteries, again. Always a step ahead when it came to sanitation, some begin installing underground channels to carry waste away from dormitories and dining halls. Gravity-powered, stone-lined, and surprisingly efficient. These early drainage systems mark a subtle revolution. Meanwhile, towns like London and Paris are struggling to cope. Their populations are swelling, and so are the cesspits. The streets reek. The rivers, especially the Thames and the Seine, are slowly turning into open-air latrines. Complaints multiply, not just from sensitive noses, but from city officials who now recognize that poor sanitation means more death, more rats, and more unpleasantness during royal parades. And so, laws begin to appear. Small ones, petty ones, but important ones. In 1370, a London bylaw fined citizens for letting their privy overflow into the neighbor's garden. A year later, a new ordinance bans the tossing of chamber pot contents from upper floors without sufficient warning. Apparently, Gardy-Loo was not enough. Builders are told to keep privies at least 6 feet from wells, which, if you think about it, feels like common sense. But in the 1300s, it was revolutionary. Bit by bit, the idea that waste should be contained, channeled, and managed begins to take hold. We're not talking porcelain flush toilets yet. Not even close. But the privy age, the age of everyone digging their own pit, flinging it out the window or offering it to their onions, is starting to lose its grip. And it's not just practicality, it's philosophy. People are starting to associate cleanliness with godliness, not just metaphorically, but literally. Monks talk about inner purity and outer hygiene. Doctors recommend air that doesn't smell like pig slop. Even nobles begin to request sweet rooms, toilets lined with herbs and kept far from dining spaces. You see one now, a garderobe lined with juniper sprigs and dried mint. A servant refreshes the bundle daily, while another lights a slow-burning charcoal block to soften the odor. It's the beginning of bathroom decor if you squint. But perhaps the biggest change is attitude. What was once shrugged off, just life, is now being questioned. Should streets really run with filth? Should rats be larger than your dog? Should your child know 5 types of diarrhea before they're 10? And somewhere, someone says no. A few try their own fixes. One merchant builds a private latrine with a wooden chute leading to a pit lined with lime. His neighbors think he's mad. 5 years later, they copy him. You meet a mason who dreams of pipes in every home. You nod politely. He's not wrong, just a few hundred years early. But for now, things are still awkward. The privy age doesn't end cleanly. It fades slowly, inconsistently in the cracks between classes, between towns, between one that can afford a stone drain and one that still relies on gravity, prayer, and a stiff breeze. Still, something is shifting. You feel it in the way people talk, in the way waste is taxed, tracked, avoided. In the hopeful tone of a physician who suggests timidly that perhaps separating drinking water from cesspools could save lives. He doesn't last long, but his ideas do. By the turn of the 15th century, the groundwork is laid not just for indoor plumbing, but for a new idea that waste isn't just something to get rid of. It's something to manage, to engineer, to build around. And with that idea, the Middle Ages begin to step, very carefully, into modernity. The wind rustles the thatched roofs. Somewhere, a baby cries, a pot clangs, and a pig shuffles out of a still steaming pile near the village green. Life goes on. You sit quietly, watching the smoke curl up from chimneys and the sun settle behind a row of gnarled apple trees. The world is still messy, still loud, still imperfect, but you've walked through the filth and found the people, the ones who wiped with moss, who whispered prayers in the outhouse, who carried buckets through frost, and refused to be ashamed of something as human as a daily routine. And in that mess, in all its smells, sounds, and sacred weirdness, you found something beautiful. A shared struggle, a shared relief, a history most won't mention but all have lived. So now, as the stars settle in, and the moon casts soft silver over the roof beams, take a deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let the noise fade. The story is done. The pits are covered. The chamber pots are clean enough. You made it through the 1300s without toilet paper. And you didn't just survive. You understood. Now close your eyes. Let the fields fall away and drift where the privies no longer reach. End of script. Sweet dreams.